Every new year always brings us changes and fresh adventures. In addition to that, as of the beginning of 2024, California has a bunch of new laws. There are employment laws that boost pay for minimum wage workers and healthcare employees, and more paid sick time benefits, and time off for employees who have suffered a reproductive loss. A controversial law prevents concealed carry of firearms in certain areas. Will it stick? And some new laws will affect how we get around, permitting speeding cameras and removing bans on cruising and lowriders. Consumers are getting a break with a ban on hidden fees on transactions. And these are just a few of the changes we'll be looking at going forward. We've got an expert to tell us how all of these new laws will affect our daily lives. Fox 11 News In Depth starts right now. Hello, everyone. I'm Hal Eisner. Happy New Year, and this is Fox 11 News In Depth. And with the new year, there are a lot of changes in California's laws, just like there are every year. Some you might love, some you might not love, but we're here to take a look at what you need to know. And joining us to do that is our Fox 11 In-Depth legal guru, Ugo Lord. And good to see you again. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Hal.
You know, every year we sort of look at these things and we say, the one that last year I thought was interesting was the jaywalking law, where all of a sudden, after years of it's not okay to jaywalk, it's okay to jaywalk.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we learn from the past. And, a lot of things that will affect people this year are the things that are going to be in the workplace.
Yes.
So I guess that's probably as good a place to start as any, because in some cases, minimum wages are going up.
Absolutely, Hal. And we look at the evolution of these laws. This becomes a natural, constant change that happens year after year. But the good news for Californians is that minimum wage nowadays, $16 an hour, effective the first of this year in 2024.
Put that in perspective with the rest of the country.
As we look nationally, we see that the national federal minimum wage is much lower than the standards in California. But when we look at California, there's even discrepancies within our own state, within our own cities. For example, Los Angeles has a higher minimum wage than other cities across the country. And West Hollywood, for example, has the highest minimum wage in the country at over $19 an hour.
And some of this stuff becomes controversial. And the reason it becomes controversial is because it comes out of the pockets of the employers. Right. And the question is, can they afford to maintain it?
Yeah, Hal, the big thing that we're really going to see, especially this year, effective April 1st, is when we see the minimum wage for the fast food industry increase. This is going up to $20 an hour. And there are already talks that these fast food industries will now have to increase what is supposed to be low-cost meals on the go. We're going to see a direct impact on how that will affect that entire industry beginning in April of this year.
And there's something called a fast food council?
Yeah, Governor
What's that going to be?
Yeah, Governor Gavin Newsom has signed into law this fast food council. And their idea behind this council is to look at not only the minimum wage requirements for fast food industries across the state, but also their working conditions. How many hours are they working? Are they constantly working part-time? Are they trying to work full-time? How are they balancing school and life? It'll look at a range of industries, a range of issues that affects the fast food industry.
Healthcare workers, they're getting a raise.
Yeah, this is actually going to be really good news for healthcare workers, because now we're talking about $23 an hour for a base pay for these healthcare workers. We're talking about medical assistants, technicians, even janitorial services in the healthcare space will see a pay bump. And the great part about this law is that it builds in a ability to increase those minimum wages every 2 years by an additional dollar, up to $25 an hour.
There are also some changes that are coming for workers when it comes to cannabis use.
Yeah, it's interesting because now we have seen a law that is now effective immediately that says that employers cannot discriminate against their employees for use of cannabis in their private time. See, that's the big kicker, Hal. We're not talking about cannabis use on the job. We're talking about cannabis use in their private lives. Employers can no longer ask employees about it. Employers can no longer test employees about cannabis use in their private time.
But there are exceptions.
Absolutely. For example, if you show up to work under the influences, then that, of course, is grounds for termination. Also, if your use of cannabis affects even use in your private time, if it affects your performance at work, then that can also be grounds for termination.
And hair and urine cannot be used to determine whether you use cannabis.
That's correct.
Unless you're in a construction job.
Exactly.
Why is that?
And the reason why is because construction workers and federal employees are held to a different standard. They're usually dealing with very dangerous materials, as well as our federal workers are working under the federal government, which the federal government does not have a legalized use of cannabis. So these are exceptions that have been carved out of this regulation.
Is California leading the pack on all of this stuff?
100%. We've seen California time and time again come out with the most revolutionary laws. And then we see gradually other states follow. We now have over 20 states, I believe it's 24 states now, that have legalized cannabis use. But it was legalized in California as one of the early states to do it. So California is constantly leading the way in this.
And then the federal government's looking at this.
Absolutely. The federal government likes to test, see what the states do, see what works for the states, and then see if a federal law is something that could be done across the country. So absolutely, they're taking a look at what we're doing right here in California to see if it's going to work.
You know, when we talk about these minimum wage issues, and we see restaurants that aren't able to stay open, there's a slippery slope there.
Yeah, the balance is that at the end of the day, when we look at inflation rates and we look at what are driving these costs, and of course we see that, yes, things are more expensive, therefore wages go up, but as the wages go up, the expenses go up too. There are businesses that may not be able to afford these new wage increases and may have to respond potentially by laying off. This law does not protect workers who potentially could be laid off if the business could no longer afford to keep them.
But this is one of those situations where one thing drives another thing into the other thing that drives into this thing. You got to afford to live in California.
Right.
You got to make enough money to live in California.
It's true.
Even if you have a job that's minimum wage, that minimum wage has to be high enough to handle these rents and other things you have to buy.
Yeah, absolutely, because we see the cost of everything go up, especially when we're talking about housing as well. So yes, with this minimum wage increases, we see an attempt to balance to pay what is commonly being referred to as a living wage.
We'll be back with Ugo Lord in the next segment of Fox 11 News In Depth. We're going to take a little look about changes in employment law, including the right to talk to your coworkers about how much money you get paid, and the right to take time off if you lose a pregnancy or even have a failed IVF treatment. We'll be right back.
It's interesting because honestly, by how
Welcome back to Fox 11 News In Depth. I'm Hal Eisner with attorney Ugo Lord. And Ugo, we kind of dipped our toe into some of the laws involving the workplace, but there are plenty of other changes. For instance, the Equal Pay and Retaliation Act. That allows you to complain about your pay. Explain.
Well, we all know the biggest taboo in the workplace is to talk about money. And this new law aims at taking that taboo off the table. The idea with this new law is that you can discuss wages not only with your boss, but also with your coworker. You can ask your coworkers how much they are making, what bonuses they received.
What would happen before if I asked my coworker what they were making? What would happen?
Now remember, we are in an at-will state, and the employer has the ability to terminate an employee for any reason, no reason at all, unless it's an unlawful reason. So before this law, if you inquired about another person's wages, it could potentially subject you to termination without any consequences.
No kidding.
Absolutely. But the difference is now...
That seems like such a benign sort of question. No. How much you make?
Now, we did have some...
That doesn't mean somebody's going to answer my question.
That's
but
true.
It's kind of like asking somebody how old you are.
Yeah, we did have some protections if you had a certain number of employees. If you had a certain number of employees, then certain businesses were required, if requested, to disclose wages of your coworkers. But now this applies to all employees of all sizes, big and small. And now you can have open conversations in the workplace without fear of retaliation.
And that went into effect?
Yeah, it is
on
now
January
in effect.
1st. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I can ask all my colleagues out here in the studio, our stage manager, our camera operator, guys, how much money are you making? And I'm good to ask that question?
Yes, they may not answer, but
they
you
may
can
not
certainly
answer,
ask.
But no ramifications. Right?
Absolutely, no ramifications.
All right, but
we'll talk during the commercial.
But that's not the only change, because when we're talking about, being able to ask things or say things, there's more.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at what you're able to say and what will actually protect you in the workplace, let's also look at when you feel about any type of workplace discrimination, now we know that there have been long-standing laws regarding protecting any type of discrimination. But what about retaliation when it comes to being wrong?
But retaliation has never been okay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But the difference is now, if you have a cause for concern that is genuine, that is a genuine cause for concern, you are protected as an employee.
Where in the past you would have had to have gone in court and sued.
Exactly, exactly.
That's a big change.
Yeah, the idea is that now we have the ability to make it better and easier for those in the workplace to feel comfortable and safe regarding their place of employment.
And we're getting more protections with regard to being sick.
Yeah, you know, the great thing about this is that when we look at paid sick leave, we are now receiving an increase of the number of days from 3 days now to 5 days. And this is paid sick leave. So if there is an illness in the family, it not only qualifies for your own illness, but it could also be an illness of a qualified family member where you would qualify for paid sick leave.
We talked about California being groundbreaking. And I think this next one really is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but we're not talking just about illnesses here. We're talking about reproductive loss.
Yeah. And this is why California is at the center of this, because oftentimes California takes the leap that other states don't.
And nobody's done this yet.
Nope. We are
just
now,
us.
Yes, we're now the very, very first when we talk about reproductive rights in the workplace. If you have any type of reproductive loss, for example, it could be a failed adoption, it could be a failed pregnancy, it could be a miscarriage, it could even be a failed IVF, you are now also allowed 5 days leave in order to mourn and grieve that type of loss.
That's so interesting. I mean, you sort of wonder how a law like that started. Where did it come from? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, when we look at what is required of our workers, we've already had on the books across the country that if you have a bereavement, that you would be able to have some sort of leave. But when you talk about a pregnancy loss, it was never classified as a bereavement. If you're a family that cannot conceive naturally and you try IVF and the IVF doesn't take, under the law, it wasn't considered a bereavement, so there was no protection. This now allows protection.
A loss of an embryo, does that create any kind of interesting conversations here?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is a brand new area of law, so there's always going to be areas of gray. We see that this law specifically targets new forms of reproduction. And we know that IVF involves a fertilized egg, but what about the failure to fertilize egg? We're in that area of gray, but under my analysis, it would still be covered under this law because the intent of the law is to protect these families whenever they experience any type of loss regarding the reproductive system, and this is a type of reproductive right.
Could this get abused?
Potentially. However, there are protections in place because in a 12-month period, the law only allows a maximum of around 20 days. So it is possible, especially with IVF, that you could try multiple times, and multiple times would tack on those 5 days. But there is a maximum in a 12-month period to prevent that abuse.
And just because we have a moment here in this segment, I want to go back to the sick leave part of this conversation. Yes. And, you know, that to be able to qualify for that, how sick you got to be?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because the term sick is always up to the determination of the healthcare professionals. So let's say, for example, you wake up in the morning and you have a cold, or you wake up in the morning and you simply don't feel well. An employer can still require some sort of medical proof of an illness. Now, this is to prevent the type of abuse that we were just talking about. But there is no specific requirement that you need a fever of a certain amount. It's all sort of relative. It's all relative. And it covers your children as well. And we know that when it comes to our kids, that potentially you may not necessarily go to a doctor every single time your kid is not feeling well, but parents know if their kids genuinely are sick. And because there's a limit of 5 days, then it also helps to prevent any type of abuse because of that limit.
You know, it's so interesting that it's kind of like we get into these new areas of law, like the reproductive loss, yes. And it's like peeling back an onion.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And does this peel lead to a new law? And then that peel, does that lead to a new law? And then one more peel, does that lead to a new law?
Yeah, Hal, these are all related because there are even reproductive laws that have come into effect in 2024 that talk specifically about what healthcare providers are able to do and different type of coverages when it comes to insurance. And they all stem from each other because one law simply leads to another.
And coming up next on Fox 11 News in Depth, we'll continue with Ugo Lord, and we'll discuss more about the new laws that we'll be dealing with in 2024. We'll take a look at a lot more of our legislation, the things that we're going to be dealing with, including the concealed carry of guns that's been battled in the court. And we'll tell you where all that is when we come back. Don't go away. That's an interesting area there, though, because in Texas, you go to, like, where my mom was, the nursing home, and their side would say no guns allowed. Welcome back to Fox 11 News in Depth. We're talking with attorney Ugo Lord about some of the new California laws we'll be dealing with this year. And one of those has to do with childhood sexual abuse. Victims now have more time to report it?
Yeah, this starts effective January 1st, 2024 of this year. So any type of abuse of a minor under the age of 18 that happened this year, that statute of limitations is now gone. But it's only for abuse that happens 2024 or after. For any abuse that happened in 2023 or before, the current statute of limitations stands.
So that's not grandfathered in?
It is not grandfathered in. So essentially, you could file a civil claim up to the age of 40 or 5 years after you discover the abuse.
That's a big change. Let's talk about that controversial concealed carry law. What exactly does that entail? And where are we with that? I mean, it's in the courts now.
Yeah, Hal, we're in the courts right now. This is an issue that we are dealing with as we speak. December 20th, we had a judge that struck down a California law that banned concealed carry weapons in certain safe zones. So we're talking about schools, hospitals, parks, sidewalks, 26 zones that are designated safe areas. Now, that was struck down on December 20th, but 10 days later, the Ninth Circuit came back and said, hey, we're going to put a stay on that injunction as it plays out in the appeals court process. So as we speak, it is law in California. You cannot bring a concealed gun in any of the 26 safe zones in the state of California. The exception, of course, is private businesses, but they have to have a sign that says it's okay to bring in a concealed weapon. Other than that, it is currently struck down as we speak.
Renters are getting a break on their security deposits.
Yeah, this is actually big. Gone are the days where you have to save 2 months, 3 months of your rent in a security deposit. Now it is only 1 month's rent as a maximum that landlords can charge.
Why? Was that viewed as being abused?
Yeah, what happened is during the pandemic, rent became extremely uncontrollable. Rent prices went up exponentially right after the pandemic. And if you charge 3 months or 2 months rent on rent that has already increased by 20%, it just became unaffordable.
Something we've talked about before is the restrictions on hidden fees. Is that changing here?
Yeah, Hal, I'm really happy about this because gone are the days where you have to now go all the way through the checkout only to discover that there's another 20% in hidden fees. Now retailers in California are required to disclose all of the hidden fees up front when you're booking something online.
Let's do a little speed round. You ready?
Let's do it. I'm ready.
All right, speed cameras, 6 pilot cities for this particular project. LA is one of them. What's this?
Yeah, I'm nervous. So this means that if you're going 11 miles per hour above the speed limit, a camera which can now be set up in Los Angeles can catch you and fine you a minimum of around $50. The good thing is that in the first 60 days, you're only going to receive a warning during this pilot program. But after that, a minimum of $50, and the faster you go, the bigger the fee.
Why was this important? Just to take the pressure off the police officers so they could do other things?
Yeah, we've seen a vast increase in number of fatalities related to excessive speed. And so the proponents for this law indicated that studies show that if you have these speed cameras, it reduces the number of drivers that are speeding, even if officers are not present.
Back in the 1980s, cruising was banned because it was viewed to be gang-related, violent. Now we can do it again?
Yeah, see, here's the thing. This was often deemed to be a quote-unquote racist ban that targeted specific minority communities. However, this ban is now gone. What it means is that you can have a low-rider classic vehicle that you modified, cruise down the street, and not have to worry about receiving a ticket.
But back then, you know, people got this idea. I mean, it was a cultural thing. It was a community thing. It was a thing that brought people together. But people thought it was all about gangs and violence. And so the law came in, and now it's been viewed that is not that case.
Yeah, because they looked at it. They looked at the research that came in from after the ban came in versus the number of violent crimes associated with gang-related activity. And there wasn't a strong enough correlation, so says the proponents of this law. So now individuals can modify their car, cruise around LA, bump up their music to legal levels, and enjoy their vehicles.
If a fentanyl dealer delivers a kilogram, what is it, gram of fentanyl, kilogram, right?
Yeah.
Then they get 3 more years on their prison sentence.
Yeah.
Does that seem a real deterrent?
Hal, we've seen studies that have said that not often are prison sentence a direct correlation with deterring activity, but it is the law. Effective immediately, if you are caught with over a kilo of distribution, that is actually selling, then 3 years are automatically tacked onto your prison sentence, which could already be up to anywhere between 10 up to 20 years. So it could be an additional 3 years on top of that.
What's an ebony alert?
Yeah, so think of amber alert, think of silver alert. There's even a feather alert here in the state of California. What it allows is for youth, especially young black women between the ages of 12 and 25, to have a direct line to individuals to be on the lookout for them. So these are alerts that go to their cell phones, alerts that will go on highways in California.
But why do we need this?
Because we've seen that with amber alerts, it often targets the majority community, and the minority community slip through the cracks when it comes to amber alerts. So the solution for that, lawmakers say, ebony alerts, which focuses on minority black, especially black women between those ages.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, we talked about reproductive loss. What about vasectomies? Let's balance the ticket here.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of protection for women in 2024 when it comes to reproduction. No copays for contraceptives, over-the-counter, no prescriptions required. But for men, now men are seeing a huge break when it comes to vasectomies. And this is vasectomies paid for by your private healthcare insurance. The cost is now going to be dramatically reduced to allow this to be a low-cost option for men as well.
So the bottom line is we're looking at such a buffet of laws, from reproductive laws to rising minimum wages, that it's a pretty remarkable spread, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like every year our heads spin with all these new laws, and it's going to be a test period. The reason why these laws pass is to see how they work, and we're going to see how they work over the year, and we'll be back next year to talk about the laws in 2025.
We'll be back next year. Thank you, Ugo Lord, for being with us. Always a pleasure. And Fox 11 News in Depth continues right after this break. Don't go away.
Thank you so much, my friend. Thank you so much. I love being here. Thank you.
Say we are, so we're still in the picture, so make sure you don't move. No, this is a lot of fun. And going through all these laws, the rapid fire.
I love the rapid fire. The way that you did the rapid fire was perfect. You got to everything that I wanted to talk about.
And finally, if you want to hear an audio version of this program, check out my podcast. You know what it's called? It's called What the Hal, and it's available wherever you subscribe to podcasts, or just go to whatthehalpodcast.com. That's it for this week's Fox 11 News In Depth. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.